Long before Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, French and English seafarers knew of a heavily forested, inhospitable land to the west of the Grand Banks. There seemed little to tempt them there, but by the beginning of the 17th century, both the French and the English had planted colonies. But wherever civilization spreads, war inevitably follows. At first, the struggle, bitter and savage though it might be, was no more than a series of raids and counter-raids. But in 1754, near the forks of the Ohio River, a minor ambush sparked off a full-scale war between Britain and France. A war which would eventually decide the fate of a continent. Except for its climactic battle on the Plains of Abraham, the struggle between Britain and France in North America was by no stretch of the imagination conducted on a level playing field. Their respective colonies were very different in character, and these differences shaped the way in which the conflict developed. The British colonies were unquestionably the stronger, better established and more populous. Beginning in Virginia, they had spread up and down the eastern seaboard of what is now the United States, north to Massachusetts Bay and south to Spanish-held Florida. In the early years of the 18th century, fighting between the rival colonies was naturally confined, for the most part, to the frontier areas of upper New York and New Hampshire. But to the French, the real threat lay in the steady, almost inexorable westward advance of the British colonists towards the Allegheny Mountains and beyond. This presented a threat which could not be ignored. Canada, or New France, was a rather precarious colony, sparsely populated and largely confined to the banks of the mighty St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes. Unlike the British colonies, it was not self-sufficient, and every winter saw it completely cut off from the outside world when the mouth of the St. Lawrence River froze. It was important, indeed vital therefore, that an overland route should be established, linking Canada with France's other American colony, Louisiana. This was soon found to be a practical enough proposition, for the Mississippi and Ohio rivers provided a suitable, if rather tenuous, highway. This lengthy corridor required protection, and so the French established way stations along the route. However, a chain of forts running from north to south across the continent also presented a quite unacceptable barrier to the westward expansion of the British colonies. Sooner or later, armed conflict was, therefore, inevitable. In April of that year, the 22-year-old Major George Washington of the Virginia militia began work on a fort at the forks of the Ohio, where the city of Pittsburgh now stands, only to be driven off by a large force of Frenchmen. The French immediately set to building their own fort on the same spot, but the Virginians were not prepared to allow matters to rest there, and Washington was sent back to re-establish the British claim to the forks. By way of encouragement, he was also promoted to lieutenant colonel, backed up with 300 regulars and a large contingent of Seneca Indians. On the 28th of May, Washington and his Indian allies ambushed a small French force near Great Meadows, and after a short fight, forced them to surrender. Unfortunately, when he questioned the prisoners, Washington learned that 500 more French troops were nearby. There was no alternative but to dig in at Great Meadows and build the ominously named Fort Necessity. The fort was badly sited, lacked a water supply, and was overlooked by wooded slopes. On the night of the 2nd of July, the French attacked, and after a 9-hour battle, Washington surrendered. The terms granted to him were generous enough. Leaving behind their artillery and military supplies, the Virginians were allowed to march home. But the Ohio Valley was now firmly in French hands. Furthermore, in return for his freedom, Washington was forced to sign a paper affirming that the Forks were indeed French territory. Thus far, the only troops involved on both sides have been colonial ones. But now the British government dramatically raised the stakes. Although the two countries were not officially at war, 2 battalions of regulars, the 44th and the 48th Foot, commanded by a former Coldstream Guardsman, Major General Edward Braddock, were ordered to sail for America. The orders for the dispatch of these troops were supposed to be secret, but word soon leaked out to the press. The French, forewarned, ordered no fewer than 6 regular battalions to sail for Canada. An attempt by the Royal Navy to intercept the French reinforcements was botched, and diplomatic relations were severed. Soon there would be out-and-out war between the two countries.
There's more than one version about the outbreak of the French and Indian Wars. For example, if you believe that the French caused the French and Indian Wars, you simply point to the fact that they established a fort at Fort Duquesne, above what is modern-day Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania, and that this was a symbol to the British of French encroachment from Canada. If you believe the British started the war, you point to George Washington, the volunteer for British forces, pathfinding his way up the Ohio River until he got to the forks of the Ohio, near Fort Duquesne, and tried to establish a British position. If you believe that it was an inevitable conflict between the two sides, you simply point to the occurrence where Washington and his forces met a French party and fired the first shots that started the war. In effect, it's a little bit more complex than that. There might not have been cause for a war in 1754. After all, the French could merely have fortified the area above the Ohio River, whereas the British expanded across the land to the banks of the Ohio. But politically and symbolically, it was too much. It was not a question of both sides coexisting side by side, but of one side giving way to the other. And incidentally, it was a question of personal ambition. What if George Washington hadn't wanted to make a military name for himself? The French and Indian War might not have started in 1754, but might have awaited the outbreak of the European conflict 2 years later.
Meanwhile, Braddock, by now in America, was nearly ready to march. He was under no illusions about the task facing him, and made sure that his soldiers were properly equipped for fighting in the woods. His objective was Fort Duquesne, at the forks of the Ohio. By the morning of the 9th of July, 1755, he was only 8 miles short of the fort and about to cross the Monongahela River. Hoping to halt or at least delay the British advance, a mixed force of French and Indians left the fort with the intention of setting an ambush on the ford. However, Braddock was by then already across the river, and both sides actually bumped into each other by accident. In the first exchange of fire, the French commander, Captain Beaujeu, was killed and many of his men fled, but the rest took cover amongst the trees and fought back. What followed was a disaster for the British. Instead of rushing the French and Indians with the bayonet, Braddock's men at first responded with disciplined volleys. Impressive though they may have sounded, these had little effect in the trees. Meanwhile, the British officers were rapidly being picked off by unseen marksmen, and their men then fell into confusion. Some individuals tried to take cover and fight in Indian style, but this only served to make matters worse. Frustrated in his attempts to organize a counterattack, and with control slipping from his grasp, Braddock ordered a retreat, only to be felled by a bullet which took 4 pain-racked days to kill him.
Braddock's attack on Fort Duquesne in 1755 should have been a British victory. He had numerical superiority, the French did not have a large amount of provisions in the fort, and French commanders in Canada were ready to retreat. But Braddock threw away the victory, in part because he accepted the advice of George Washington. Washington said to send an advance element of Braddock's force across the river, thus splitting the British Army in two. That advance force, strung out along the road leading to Fort Duquesne, was attacked by a French party which happened to come across its path. More importantly, the British had themselves in a position where they are surrounded by trees and gullies on both sides of the road. That meant that the French and Indians were not susceptible to the bayonet charge, the one close quarters strategy that could have ensured an overwhelming victory. Instead, British soldiers trying to fire volleys were picked off one by the French and Indian forces, and ultimately Braddock retreated. It's no longer remembered this way, in part because George Washington would later get glory in the 1750s in the French and Indian Wars. But in effect, the British threw away an opportunity in 1755 which could have ended the French and Indian Wars more than 4 years before the final events that took place at Montreal.
Once again, the French were left in undisputed control of the land west of the Alleghenies.
There's a great tendency to look at the French and Indian Wars as stereotypes as far as the army is concerned. On the one hand, you've got the British regulars, very stiff, red uniforms, pipe clay everywhere, got absolutely no idea what they're doing in the forest. And then you've got the wily American provincials, most notably, of course, Robert Rogers and his Rangers, but other provincials such as the Virginia Regiment, who knew how to do it properly, to hide behind trees and fight in Indian fashion. And therefore, going on from there, it's no wonder that the British lost the Revolutionary War a couple of years later. In actual fact, the situation was very different. The British regulars, when they first came over, obviously didn't have much idea as to the forest fighting. It was a new concept entirely. They had no previous experience of it. Nevertheless, Braddock, although dismissed as a bit of a martinet and an empty-headed, wooden-headed guardsman, had a fair idea what was about and did his best to prepare them for it. As the war went on, they built on those lessons. The British soldier is and always has been a very adaptable soldier. By the end of the war, British regulars could fight the best of them in the forest. The British regulars really knew what they were doing. The provincials, on the other hand, yes, at the start of the war they had some idea. I mean, they'd been going out into the woods for some time, or at least some of them had. And it was all very well for the backwoodsmen to know what they were doing in the forest. But a lot of the American provincial troops came from coastal towns. They'd never seen Indians except in pictures, just as the British soldiers had. And they too had their lessons to learn. Although it was easy enough for the British soldier, through his training and through the training mechanisms, to learn how to fight in the woods, because the American force was far worse disciplined, it was a lot more difficult for them to learn how to fight in the open and how to drill as the British regulars did. And the camp discipline was very poor. One thing which was commented on frequently by British commentators was how dirty the Americans were and how susceptible as a result they were to disease. And this is something which came out again in the Revolution. The American armies tried to invade Canada, and although a lot of them got shot in the process, far more of them died of smallpox and other camp-related diseases, and elsewhere. So that although on the face of it it's quite easy to think of the blundering British and the wily Americans, in practice this wasn't really the case.
A new British commander, John Campbell, Earl of Loudon, then arrived to take over what was left of Braddock's army and to prepare for a renewed offensive. It was going to take time to prepare it properly, however, and in the meantime the French strengthened their defenses. The chain of forts which protected New France and the overland route to Louisiana were far more than crude frontier stockades. Massive fortresses such as Louisbourg, which guarded the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, were built in the most modern European style, with mighty stone-faced ramparts and ditches, defended by a large garrison with many guns. Far inland, deep in the American wilderness, Fort Niagara was constructed in accordance with European principles, and in 1759 it would take a formal European-style siege to capture the place.
Fort Niagara had a critical location for the French and later for the British, but primarily its importance to the French stemmed from the fact that it guarded the portage around Niagara Falls, and that was also the main route of communications between what most people think of as New France, that is Canada and the St. Lawrence Valley, and the posts of the upper Great Lakes, but also the colony of Louisiana. And trade goods, communication, equipment was moving around the Niagara Portage. The importance became even greater when the French decided to begin to establish forts in the upper Ohio Valley, because Niagara was the point through which they were being supplied, and the French armies operating in the Ohio were getting a large part of their military supplies through Fort Niagara. The British recognized that very early. Even when General Edward Braddock was sent over here, there was some debate as to whether he should attempt to attack Fort Duquesne in the Ohio Valley or whether he should strike at Niagara. And the intention had been for him to, first of all, then capture Fort Duquesne and then move against Niagara. The British made an attempt in 1755 to mount an expedition here. They were unable to do so. But when they did finally capture Fort Niagara in 1759, they severed all serious French communications between the main part of the colony and the interior.
In order to pierce this cordon of forts, Loudon decided upon a three-pronged attack. One column would make another attempt to capture Fort Duquesne, and thus sever the link between Canada and Louisiana. The second column would push northwards from New York by way of Lake George against the French forts and settlements of Upper Canada. And the third would take Louisburg before proceeding up the St. Lawrence to Quebec.
The 7 Years' War in North America, the French and Indian War as it's called in the United States, had a major impact on the forts. And new forts were constructed, of course, but the old forts like Niagara, which had been a fort for over 30 years by the time the war broke out, were often altered. And Fort Niagara is probably the best example of that. From going from a simple wooden stockade around a large stone house, Fort Niagara was expanded between the fall of 1755 and the fall of 1757 by the construction of what technically was a large hornwork constructed of earthen walls, sodded to prevent erosion, that basically protected the land side approaches to the position. The hornwork, which really is a curtain wall with a half bastion on each side and then advanced works ahead of that, was a kind of construction that was used when you were concerned really about attack from only one direction. And here on this peninsula, that was feasible. The river and lakesides had walls, but they were very, very small. The lines that are preserved here today have been altered many, many times, but they follow the original trace of the walls that were laid out in 1755 by a French officer named Pierre Pouchot.
In the meantime, a savage guerrilla war raged along the frontier. Many of those involved on both sides were the American Indians. Their employment was controversial. They were undoubtedly cruel and bloodthirsty. Like so many tribal peoples, they employed that cruelty deliberately. They reasoned that it was better to achieve their aims through terror. They considered more merciful the killing of a few rather than the wholesale slaughter of the European-style battlefield.
Indian warfare was based on the blood law, and that was a revenge for some atrocity to you, to one of our clan, a clan member, and it was absolutely our duty as a police action, not on a national scale, but as a local police action to avenge that atrocity, literally an eye for an eye. And that's all they were after. They were going for the scalp. That was the warrior's top knot braid was the most important part. So when you take that scalp, you have the spirit. The European wars changed the old traditional ways of the old blood law. So instead of one scalp, now, because the wars disrupted the fur trade, and we have traditional wars going on at all times. Imagine living in a state of perpetual warfare for your entire life and your people for the entire history of your people. This is basically how Indian people have lived.
Commanders such as General Montcalm also complained about the lack of commitment among Indian allies and a tendency to drift off home at the slightest opportunity. They also displayed an entirely sensible attitude to the prospect of getting killed. They avoided it as much as possible. After all, they had little or nothing to gain from the conflict.
Genocide was not unknown. The Erie, who lived just to the west of here, were annihilated. Where are the Susquehanna? Where are the Erie? You know, they were annihilated in the very early Indian Wars. So the idea of Indian warfare is to go out with your members of your clan and advance on the enemy and do the damage that you could do. They would strip down as light as possible. No heavy coats, no heavy cartridge boxes on the hip. This is very tight equipment. It can be held with one hand, and you have your weapon and maybe a hand axe in your belt, and that's it. And you go in as quick as you can at dawn. Rarely, if ever, fight at night. It's the time when the spirits roam the earth, and you kind of want to stay in one place, in a safe place. You know, they would go out for maybe 6 months to a year, even years at a time. So when the Europeans came to the villages and saw the men laying around, they called them lazy. What they were doing is resting.
There were other men who could fight in the woods besides the Indians, and unlike them could be relied upon to carry out military operations efficiently. On the French side were colony troops, independent companies belonging oddly enough to the Navy, la Marine. These were tough, resourceful regulars, largely led by Canadian officers, and opposing them were the Rangers.
Rogers Rangers were guerrilla fighters. They fought Indian fashion, unlike the normal British soldier that fought in the usual big groups firing volleys at each other. They fought against the Indians and the Canadians on the flanks of the armies normally, the British Army. They also would go out and they would get intelligence on the French and the Canadians and their Indian allies, as well as bring in prisoners, take scalps, and do anything they could do to harass the opposition.
The most successful of all the Ranger leaders was a New Hampshire man named Robert Rogers. His standing orders still form part of the present United States Army Ranger Handbook.
1. Don't forget nothing. 2. Have your musket clean as a whistle, hatchet scoured, 60 rounds, powder and ball, and be ready to march at a minute's warning. 3. When you're on the march, act the way you would, as if you was sneaking up on a deer. See the enemy first. 4. Tell the truth about what you see and what you do. There's an army depending on us for correct information. You can lie all you please when you tell other folks about the Rangers, but don't never lie to a Ranger nor officer. 5. Don't never take a chance you don't have to. 6. When you're on the march, we march in single file, far enough apart so one shot can't go through 2 men. 7. If we strike swamps or soft ground, we spread out abreast, so it's hard to track us. 8. When we march, we keep moving till dark, so as to give the enemy the least possible chance at us. 9. When we camp, half the party stays awake, while the other half sleeps. 10. If we take prisoners, we keep them separate like, till we've had time to examine them, so they can't cook up a story between them.
Throughout the rest of 1755 and 1756, British and French troops bickered along the frontier. Yet more reinforcements were sent to America, including 3 battalions of Highlanders. Nevertheless, 1757 opened with a failed attempt to take Louisbourg. And then in July, another disaster as the French took Fort William Henry. For a short while, it looked as though the victorious General Montcalm might follow up his success by advancing down the Hudson Valley against New York itself. Instead, hungry and ravaged by disease, it was the French army which retreated northwards to Ticonderoga. Loudon, although a competent enough administrator, was clearly too indecisive, and a new commander-in-chief, Jeffrey Amherst, was appointed. Amherst began promisingly enough by successfully besieging and capturing Louisbourg. When that mighty fortress fell at the end of July 1758, he intended to push on up the St. Lawrence towards Quebec. In this, however, he was to be disappointed, for yet another setback had occurred. Amherst's less than distinguished subordinate, General Abercrombie, had been ordered to push northwards up the Hudson Valley and beyond to take Ticonderoga. He had more than sufficient men and resources for the job. Furthermore, Ticonderoga was badly situated and could not withstand a formal siege. Unfortunately, Abercrombie proceeded to throw away all these advantages in an ill-conceived frontal assault. Battalion after battalion was sacrificed, hurled vainly against the French defenses and cut to ribbons by grape shot and musketry. As if this was not enough, a second attempt on Fort Duquesne also ran into trouble. The Highlanders forming the advance guard were ambushed, and it was nearly 6 months before a third and successful attack could be mounted. Once again, the British offensive against Canada had stalled. Once again, it was left to the Rangers to keep up the pressure.
11. Don't ever march home the same way. Take a different route so you won't be ambushed. 12. No matter whether we travel in big parties or little ones, each party has to keep a scout 20 yards ahead, 20 yards on each flank, and 20 yards in the rear, so the main body can't be surprised and wiped out. 13. Every night you'll be told where to meet if surrounded by a superior force. 14. Don't sit down to eat without posting sentries. 15. Don't sleep beyond dawn. Dawn's when the French and Indians attack. 16. Don't cross a river by a regular ford. 17. If somebody's trailing you, make a circle like. Come back on your own tracks and ambush the folks that aims to ambush you. 18. Don't stand up when the enemy's coming against you. Kneel down, lie down, hide behind a tree. 19. Let the enemy come till he's almost close enough to touch. Then let him have it and jump out and finish him with your hatchet.
With Amherst in New York to take personal charge of the northward thrust to the Great Lakes, a new commander was needed for the expedition against Quebec. The man chosen was the 32-year-old Major General James Wolfe. The British Army of the 18th century is often seen as a bastion of privilege, an army composed of the very dregs of society, commanded by aristocratic officers. As with all generalizations, there was a certain element of truth in this. But taken as a whole, the army was actually a highly professional force, in which merit was readily rewarded and soldiers were led, not driven, into battle. By and large, of course, it was the aristocrats and landed gentry who made it to the very top, since they could command influence as well as wealth. But the majority of regimental officers came from quite modest backgrounds. They were the sons of minor gentry and of professional men such as doctors and clergymen. Some were even the sons of tradesmen. A significant group, naturally enough, were themselves the sons of soldiers. One such was James Wolfe. In 1741, at the age of 14, Wolfe obtained a commission in one of the newly raised regiments of Marines. But finding himself to be a martyr to seasickness, he quickly transferred to the 12th Foot. By 1746, he was a captain and serving as a brigade major on General Hawley's staff at the Battle of Culloden. He signified his willingness to serve again in North America, and some judicious lobbying won him command of the Quebec expedition, and with it the local rank of Major General. To take Quebec, he was given some 8,500 men, nearly all of them regulars. There was no cavalry, but instead he had 6 companies of Rangers. Understanding little of the realities of frontier warfare, he had at first heartily despised his Rangers and frequently complained of their conduct. As far as Wolfe was concerned, his entire reliance would be placed on his 10 battalions of regulars.
The British Army didn't like the Rangers, particularly Rogers or any other Ranger group, because a lot of times these Ranger groups would go out a few miles from the fort and they never really conducted any mission or intelligence work, come back in, and it would become obvious to the British that this was all a facade, that nothing had happened. So they decided the only way they could get trustworthy intelligence was to form their own ranging units, and by doing that they formed light infantry companies. They had Rogers actually form a cadet company of gentlemen volunteers, which were privates in the Army. And after they went through the training, they became officers within the British Army. And then they went back either to their own regiment, but more often to another regiment, where they would become the trainer type person to train the new men that would become light infantrymen. And then these men would serve in the same capacity within a British regiment that the Rangers had already served. That's how that evolved. And we use that today. The Army Rangers and the Army Green Berets in the United States claim their lineage back to Rogers Rangers. And the British light infantry actually could be claimed by our Army light infantry today as well. Or we have light infantry units in the U.S. Army today.
In a fine example of inter-service cooperation, this little army was carried up the St. Lawrence by the Royal Navy, and on the 26th of June, 1759, Wolfe disembarked at the Ile d'Orléans, just 4 miles from Quebec. The French were utterly dismayed. Starved of reinforcements from home, they had hoped that the notoriously difficult passage of the St. Lawrence would delay the British advance. Instead, served by excellent navigators such as James Cook, the Navy made short work of negotiating the shoals. The city itself was built on a high promontory, jutting out into the St. Lawrence at the point where it was entered by the small river St. Charles. There was no realistic prospect of launching an amphibious assault directly against the city, and the landward side was covered by modern fortifications. Before any kind of assault could be made on these defenses, it was first necessary to land somewhere on the north bank of the river. But here Wolfe found that the French had forestalled him by constructing what were known as the Beauport lines. This was a series of fortifications and entrenched camps stretching eastwards along the shore for 8 miles downstream of Quebec. Frustrated, Wolfe established his own camp still further downstream, close by the mouth of the Montmorency River. There he pondered how best to proceed. The first solution he came up with was an amphibious assault on the eastern end of the Beauport lines. This was to be carried out at low tide and accompanied by a simultaneous attack along the beach from his camp, just to the east of the Montmorency Falls. Even if the Montmorency position could be forced, Wolfe would then be faced with another and equally strong set of fortifications covering the St. Charles River. And only after he had fought his way through these would he finally be able to begin operations against Quebec itself. Not surprisingly, perhaps, his health gave way under the stress, but one last daring attempt remained to be made. The operation began at 1 a.m. on the morning of the 13th of September. Wolfe set off with some 1,700 men in 30 boats. In the first 6 was a battalion of light infantry under Colonel William Howe. Behind them came a further 6 battalions, including the 78th Highlanders. In the meantime, some rather obvious preparations were made by the Navy, as if to attempt another landing on the Beauport shore. This diversion was completely successful. Montcalm mustered his troops there, and in the meantime the real assault force, passing itself off as a French provisions convoy, made its way to the landing place above Quebec. At 4 o'clock, the first wave began disembarking, and at dawn an incredulous Montcalm first saw the red-coated British army drawn up on the plains of Abraham facing the city. At this point, he panicked. Wolfe's position was actually quite precarious. Before him lay a formidable and as yet unbeaten French army. Somewhere behind him was another French force of unknown size under a Colonel de Bougainville, and already on his flanks were growing bands of Canadian militia and Indians. With virtually no prospect of retreat, a defeat now would be the worst disaster ever suffered by a British army in North America. Instead of waiting a few hours to coordinate his counterattack with Bougainville's men, Montcalm decided to attack as soon as he could assemble his own army. Wolfe's men had already managed to drag 2 light cannon up the path from the Anse de Foulon, and he thought that they were also digging in. Once they were entrenched, he thought that he would never be able to shift them. An immediate attack it would have to be, no matter what the consequences of failure.
The tactical situation on the morning of the battle is quite interesting. On the one hand, you've got the British army drawn up at the top of the cliffs, facing the city. Behind them, there's a French army of unknown strength, and nobody's really sure at this stage how close they are. And in front of them, you've got an even larger French army. If the British lose the battle, they're going to be absolutely wiped out. They'll be forced to surrender because there is no possibility of them being able to execute an orderly retreat down the cliffs into the boats and away. Therefore, Wolfe was taking a very great risk. Arguably, he had to take that risk. If the British didn't win that battle there and then, they could kiss goodbye to any chance of taking Quebec that year and probably the following year as well. On the other hand, from that point of view, Montcalm probably had everything to gain by waiting. He could wait, gather his men properly, get more militiamen pulled in to join his regulars, and most importantly, make contact with Bougainville and the other French army which is in Wolfe's rear. The 2 armies combined, augmented with extra militia, would have been far superior to anything the British could put up against them. But Montcalm didn't do that. In essence, he panicked. He pulled his men together, just every man he could lay his hands on at that moment, and rushed straight into battle. Arguably, from his point of view, he had to do it. The city was possibly untenable. Wolfe had no guns big enough to batter the walls. He had no time to get them up. Montcalm may or may not have known this. He seems to have thought that the British were throwing up batteries. And it's quite possible the city could have been stormed there and then, as the Americans tried to do some years later. The Americans were unsuccessful, and it's possible, I think we can say, that the British would have been equally unsuccessful at the time. But Montcalm didn't really stop to think. As far as he was concerned, the city was in danger, and more importantly, his own supply lines were in danger. Everything which came to his army in the way of food and ammunition came along the road from Montreal across the plains of Abraham, where Wolfe was sitting. As far as he was concerned, he had to get Wolfe out of the way there and then, and so he marched, and ultimately marched into disaster.
As the name suggests, the plains of Abraham were fairly featureless, although a little higher towards the city. Along the top of the bluffs overlooking the St. Lawrence, there was a fair amount of scrub, infested with Canadian and Indian snipers, but otherwise the battlefield was clear and open. The 2 armies about to contend upon it were also pretty much of a size, both being about 4,500 strong, but they were very different in character and quality. All of the British soldiers drawn up on the plain that morning were well-trained regulars, but about half the French were Canadian militia. On Montcalm's right, near the St. Charles River, were a number of skirmishers from the Quebec militia, with a fair sprinkling of Indians amongst them. Next, forming the extreme right of the battle line proper, came a formed battalion of Quebec militia, and some other militiamen from Montreal. Then came 5 small battalions of French regulars. Waiting for them as they surged forward was a rather lonely-looking line of British redcoats. The 35th Foot should have formed a part of that line, but instead they had become involved in a little battle of their own, as they fought to prevent the French skirmishers from cutting the path down to the cove. From right to left, therefore, the British front line consisted of a small composite battalion of grenadiers. Then the 28th, 43rd, 47th, 78th and 58th Foot. Behind the army, and stretched very thinly indeed, the 48th Foot stood in reserve. As the French approached the 6 battalions forming Wolfe's front line, they began firing at long range. The Canadians, serving both in the militia and as reinforcements for the regular battalions, were not used to fighting at close quarters in the open. Instead of pressing forward with the bayonet, they fired, then threw themselves down to reload. As a result, the regular battalions were thrown into disorder, but they still continued to storm forward. Then, with just 60 yards to go, the British battalions opened fire. It was not the single crashing volley of popular legend. Instead, as the French approached, Wolfe's men began what was described as a regular platoon fire. Rather than have each man discharge his firelock at once, British infantry battalions were divided into 4 grand divisions, and each division was in turn divided into 4 platoons. When the command was given to fire, only 1 platoon in each division did so, and then the next, and so on, until by the time the 4th platoon had fired, the 1st had reloaded and was ready to fire again. The result was a relentless meat-grinding barrage of fire, which wore down the advancing French, weakening them so that a final mass volley, delivered at only a few yards' range, finally broke them. As the French fell back in confusion, Colonel Simon Fraser, one-time Master of Lovat and Jacobite officer, led forward his 78th Highlanders, broadsword in hand. It was probably the last of the old-style Highland charges, and it turned a disorderly retreat into a panic-stricken rout. At the very moment of victory, however, General Wolfe was struck down by one of the snipers lurking in the scrubland. Leading on the Grenadier Battalion, he received a wound which shattered his right wrist, but binding it up, he carried on, only to be shot again through the body. Within a few moments, he was dead, but not before he was assured of victory. Oddly enough, the Marquis de Montcalm was also shot down at about the same time and carried dying into the city. At a crucial moment, the French army was left leaderless, and preventing any chance of its being rallied. By this time, Colonel de Bougainville was belatedly hurrying up from the west with both cavalry and infantry. But Townsend's brigade swung around to face them, and they hurriedly backed off. Nevertheless, although de Bougainville had been too late to influence the battle on the Plains of Abraham, his unwelcome appearance prevented the British from seizing the crossing of the St. Charles River and bottling up the remains of Montcalm's army at Beauport. As a result, the survivors escaped that night to fight another day.
The battle on the Plains of Abraham above Quebec provides a very useful illustration of the 2 very different tactical systems employed by the British and French armies. The British army was very much orientated towards firepower. The men were trained incessantly in loading, firing, and to a very great extent in marksmanship as well. The French army, on the other hand, rather took the view that a musket existed as something to stick a bayonet in the end of. So the result was that at Quebec, the British army stood there doing what it did best. The French army tried to do what it did best, which was to rush forward in a very Gallic fashion, cheering, yelling their heads off and waving the bayonets, and rather as the British army had done at Culloden not very many years before, they stood there and shot them to bits.
Quebec surrendered a few days later. The capture of the city was in the end to be decisive. But for the moment, it remained to be seen whether the victorious British army could hold on to it over the coming winter. And in the meantime, the war went on. The tide might have turned at last, but hard fighting still lay ahead before the capture of Montreal and the final surrender of the French. For many years, the Abenaki Indians of St. Francis have been a particular problem on the frontiers of New England. And in September 1759, Major Robert Rogers received orders from General Amherst to undertake a punitive expedition against them. What followed was one of the most famous of his raids, After a journey of 22 days, 9 of them through a waterlogged spruce bog, they at length arrived outside the village of St. Francis, and a reconnaissance discovered the Indians engaged in celebrating a wedding.
Half an hour before sunrise, we surprised the village, approaching it in 3 divisions, on the right, left, and center, which was effected with so much caution and promptitude on the part of the officers and men that the enemy had no time to recover themselves or to take arms in their own defense until they were almost destroyed. Some few escaped to the water, but my people sunk their canoes and shot those who attempted to escape by swimming. We then set fire to all their houses, excepting 3, reserved for the use of the party. The fire consumed many Indians who had concealed themselves in the cellars and the lofts of their houses and would not come out. At 7 o'clock in the morning, the affair was completely over. We had by that time killed 200 Indians and taken 20 of their women and children prisoners. 15 of the latter I suffered to go their own way and brought home with me 2 Indian boys and 3 girls. 5 English captives were also found and taken into our care. On parading the detachment, Captain Ogden was found to be badly wounded, being shot through the body, but still able to perform his duty. 6 privates were wounded, and 1 Stocksbridge Indian killed.
Now Rogers had to get back to Crown Point, and that proved the most difficult, and in the end the most terrible part of the operation. Shortly after leaving his boats, Rogers learned that they had been discovered by the French, and that a large detachment was on his track. Outnumbered by 2 to 1, there was no alternative but to swing off into the wilderness and make his way by Lake Memphremagog and down the Connecticut River to a fort known simply as Number 4. Rogers had relied upon finding sufficient provisions for his men at St. Francis, but unfortunately most of the stores had been lost when the village was burned and only a small quantity of corn remained. It was November before the Rangers straggled back to Crown Point, and by that time 3 officers and 46 men had either been killed by their pursuers or had died of hunger or privation on the way. It was a sad end to a daring venture, but it proved to the French and their Indian allies that nowhere was safe from Rogers and his men. In the meantime, the new French commander, the Chevalier de Lévis, prepared for one last attempt to break the British stranglehold on Canada. He knew that in the summer of 1760 he was almost certain to be assailed from 3 different directions: up the St. Lawrence from Quebec, down the river from Niagara, and from the south by way of Lake Champlain. He had insufficient men to fight off all 3, and therefore resolved to strike first at Quebec. Concentrating no fewer than 8 battalions of regulars and all the colonial troops and militia he could lay his hands on, he moved north in April. The British commander in Quebec, Brigadier Murray, moved out to meet him, and in a second battle on the plains of Abraham, the 2 armies drew up in the half-melted snow. Strangely enough, they were in the opposite positions to those they had occupied the previous September. This time it was the British, badly outnumbered, who attacked as Montcalm had done. And this time, too, it was the British who were defeated and driven back in disorder. Lévis now proceeded to besiege Quebec, and although he had very few heavy guns, he knew from experience where the weak spots in the wall were to be found. Unfortunately, he was also desperately short of powder and could only afford to fire 20 rounds per day. This was clearly no way to conduct a siege, but the Royal Navy had been forced to withdraw from the river by the onset of winter. Now the ice at the mouth of the St. Lawrence was melting. If a French squadron could get into the river before the British returned, Lévis could be able to recapture Quebec and Canada might yet be saved. On the evening of the 25th of May, 2 men of war were seen making their way up the river, the Vanguard, and the Diana. The Royal Navy had won the race and Canada's fate was sealed. The rest of the campaign was merely a foregone conclusion. As Lévis had foreseen, the British gradually closed in on Montreal, and on the 8th of September 1760, he reluctantly agreed to surrender. Amherst, ungenerously, refused to allow the French the honors of war, so that night Lévis ordered his proud battalions to burn their colors rather than hand them over. Fighting did not end with this final symbolic act. Out to the west, tiny French garrisons still flew the lily flag of France and encouraged Indian war parties to carry on the fight. Canada may have surrendered, but Louisiana sustained these lost soldiers until the final end of the war in 1763, and then a new war loomed on the horizon.
The irony of the French and Indian Wars was that Britain had won one war only to lose another. Sure, she had expelled France from the United States and from all but a small portion of Canada. But in doing so, she fought a war which was not perceived by Americans as being a battle of equals, Britain and the American colonists fighting side by side against the dreaded French, but one in which American forces were used and manipulated to support a British battle. For example, American volunteers were not allowed to have any kind of officer rank in the British Army. For example, the American people, not the people of Britain, were expected to pay for the cost of the war in taxes on tea, taxes on sugar, taxes on stamps throughout the 1760s. In the end, the war became one not of honor, of Britain and America standing side by side, but of exploitation, in which Britain used the Americans as a pawn against the French. It was resentment over this that started the chain of events which led to the Revolutionary War of the 1770s, and which ended in the expulsion of not only France, but also Britain from the United States.
Freed of the threat posed by French Canada, the American colonies began to look to their own destiny. Although it was British regulars who had achieved victory, provincial regiments and provincial leaders such as George Washington had learned their trade. Within a few short years of the fall of New France, they were to put that experience to good use.